How did the Republican Party begin?
The Republican Party, one of the two principal political parties of the United States, was founded in 1854 by those opposing the extension of slavery into new territories. The party mustered enough support to elect their candidate in 1860, Abraham Lincoln, 1809 to 1865. During the 1880s, party members nicknamed themselves the Grand Old Party. The vestige of this nickname is still around today, as the GOP. There have been 17 Republican presidents.
How old is the oldest clock?
The first mechanical timekeeping device was a water clock called a clepsydra, which was used from about 1500 B.C. through the Middle Ages, 500-1350. One very elaborate clepsydra was constructed for Holy Roman Emperor Charlemagne, 742 to 814, in a D 800, upon the hour, it dropped a metal ball into a bowl. Because of problems with water, it evaporated, froze, and eroded the surfaces of its container. A more accurate device was needed. It is believed that the first completely mechanical clock was developed by a monk around 1275. The clock was driven by the slow pull of a falling weight that had to be reset to its starting position after several hours. The clocks in monasteries were among the first to be fitted as alarm clocks. Striking mechanisms were added to the timekeeping devices so the monks would know when to ring the monastery bell. Other calendars remain in use in the world today, including the lunar Babylonian, Chinese, and Muslim calendars, the Jewish calendar, which is a combination of solar and lunar, and the solar Coptic, Japanese, and Hindu calendars. Secular calendars include the Julian day, used by astronomers, and the perpetual calendar, which gives the days of the week for the Julian and the Gregorian calendar, and therefore is used by historians and other scholars to reconcile world events along a single timeline.
Why was the election of Vicente Fox a landmark?
The July 2000 election of businessman-turned-politician Vicente Fox, 1942, was monumental in Mexico's political history because it ousted the Institutional Revolutionary Party, PRI, that had ruled the nation for 71 years. It was a victory not only for Fox but for his National Action Party, PAN. The former Coca-Cola Company executive had turned to politics in the 1980s. Following a highly successful career in business, in 1987 Fox was elected to the National Chamber of Deputies, and in 1995 he was voted in as governor of his home state of Guanajuato. He promised voters economic and political reform, with a particular emphasis on ridding the nation's government of seemingly endemic corruption. Fox was sworn into office on December 1, 2000, for a 6-year term. In 2003 midterm elections, Fox's PAN party lost ground to the PRI.
What was the golden age of ancient Greece?
It is the period of classical Greek civilization that followed the so-called Dark Ages of Greece, which came to an end about 800 B.C. Over time the Dorians had become more settled, and they gradually revived trade and culture on mainland Greece. The self-governing city-state, polis, evolved, including the military center of Sparta and Athens, which became a center for the arts, education, and democracy. This was the beginning of the Great Hellenic period of classical Greek civilization. Greek civilization reached its height in Athens during the mid-400s BC. A period of outstanding achievement known as the Golden Age.
What were the freedom rides?
The Freedom Rides were a series of bus rides designed to test the U.S. Supreme Court's prohibition of segregation in interstate travel. In 1960, in the case of Boynton v. Virginia, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of a Howard University student who charged that segregation laws at the Richmond, Virginia, bus station violated federal anti-segregation laws. The Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, decided to test the enforcement of the federal law by initiating the Freedom Rides. On May 4, 1961, 13 people, black and white, boarded a bus for the South. Meant as a nonviolent means of protest against local segregation laws. The riders were nevertheless met with violence, when the bus reached Montgomery, Alabama. On May 20, a white mob was waiting, the Freedom Riders were beaten. Rioting broke out in the city, and U.S. Marshals were sent to restore order. The interracial campaign to desegregate transportation was ultimately successful. But government intervention was required to enforce the laws, as numerous Southern whites had demonstrated that they weren't going to comply voluntarily.
Why are Kant's philosophies still relevant?
Immanuel Kant, 1724–1804, remains one of the great modern thinkers because he developed a whole new philosophy. One that completely reinterpreted human knowledge. A professor at Germany's Königsberg University beginning in 1755. Kant lectured widely and was a prolific writer. His most important work came somewhat late in life after 1775.
What was the Beat movement?
The post-World War II era bred unprecedented prosperity and an uneasy pace in the United States. Out of this environment rose the Beat generation. Alienated youths who rejected society's new materialism and threw off its square attitudes to reinvent cool. The Beat generation of the 1950s bucked convention, embraced iconoclasm, and attracted attention. Mainstream society viewed them as anarchists and degenerates. But many American youths listened to and read the ideas of its leaders, including writers Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac, whose novel On the Road, 1957, was the Bible of the Beat movement, William Burroughs, and Lawrence Ferlinghetti, the Beatniks, as they were dubbed by their critics, believed in peace, civil rights, and radical protest as a vehicle for change. They also embraced drugs, mystical, Eastern, religions, and sexual freedom, all controversial ideas during the post-war era. Beat writers and artists found their homes in communities like San Francisco's North Beach, Los Angeles's Venice Beach, and New York City's Greenwich Village. The movement merged, or some would argue, gave birth to the counterculture movements of the 1960s, including the hippies. Beat literature is the movement's legacy.
Will Mother Teresa be sainted?
As of the early 2000s, Mother Teresa of Calcutta was on the road to sainthood. On October 19, 2003, she was beatified. A key step in the process that began just 2 years after her death. Her worldwide reputation of holiness prompted Pope John Paul II, 1920 to 2005, to waive the customary 5-year waiting period for the cause of canonization to begin. Mother Teresa's heroic virtues, a requirement for sainthood, were well known long before she died. The modern martyr spent nearly 70 years working as a missionary among the poor, the last 50 of them in outreach to society's most downtrodden, the impoverished, sick and dying. She lived modestly, dressed simply, usually in a plain white sari, which she felt identified her with the poor, and devoted herself wholly to helping those society had forgotten. The so-called Saint of the Gutter received worldwide recognition for her work. In 1979 she was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Though she came into contact with some of the world's most influential people, she was unchanged by the attention. When the Pope gave her a Lincoln Continental for her own personal transportation, she auctioned it off to raise needed funds for her works of charity. Reportedly, when she visited Britain's Princess Diana, 1961 to 1997, the nun looked on the large rooms in the royal palace and uttered something to the effect of, "Just think how many people could live in these rooms." Another requirement of sainthood is involvement in miracles. In October 2002 it was reported that Pope John Paul's office had attributed a miracle to Mother Teresa. A young Indian woman was cured of a stomach tumor after praying to her. The Vatican, however, found no scientific explanation for the woman's recovery. On December 20, 2002, the Pope approved the decrees of her heroic virtues and miracles, paving the way for Mother Teresa's beatification in 2003. Her sainthood appeared to be imminent.
When did diamond mining begin in Africa?
In 1867, discovery of a pretty pebble along the banks of the Orange River in South Africa led to the finding of a rich diamond field near present-day Kimberley. The city was founded as a result of the mining, in 1871. Similar to the California gold rush roughly a decade and a half earlier. The finding in central South Africa prompted people from Britain and other countries to flock to the area. However, the ultimate outcome was conflict, since both the British and the Boers, who were Dutch descendants living in South Africa, claimed the Kimberley area. The First Boer War ensued in 1880.
Who was Enrico Fermi?
The Italian-born physicist Enrico Fermi, 1901–1954, was one of the chief architects of the nuclear age. In 1934, Fermi announced that he had discovered elements beyond uranium. But what he had really done, and which was later proved, was split the atom. In 1938, just before World War II, 1939–45, this process was named nuclear fission. And 1 year later, German-born physicist Albert Einstein, 1879–1955, would write a letter to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, 1882–1945, urging the American government to study this process, which releases energy. Also in 1938, Fermi was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics and he escaped Italy, where the fascist regime of Benito Mussolini, 1883–1945, had taken hold. Fermi became a professor of physics at Columbia University in 1939, where he taught for 3 years. In 1942 he got involved in the Manhattan Project, which was developing the atomic bomb. In that capacity, he directed the first controlled nuclear chain reaction. After World War II, Fermi, who had become an American citizen in 1944, taught at the University of Chicago and continued his research on the basic properties of nuclear particles. In 1953 he had an element named after him, fermium, an artificially created radioactive element. The U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, AEC, honors accomplishments in physics with the Enrico Fermi Award.
Why did the auto industry boom in the post-war era?
In the years following World War II, 1939–45, auto ownership in the United States soared. From 27.5 million registered vehicles in 1940 to 61.5 million in 1960. Americans had resumed their love affair with the automobile, inextricably linking the car with the U.S. history of the post-war era. Many factors combined to bring about the automobile's widespread popularity. During World War II, the car manufacturers curtailed auto production, converting factories to military production and turning out some $29 billion in materials, including trucks, jeeps, tanks, aircraft, engines, artillery, and ammunition. With the conflict ended, automakers stepped up production to fulfill the unmet demand of the war years, and soon found themselves working to meet new demand, created by an increase in consumer spending and the growth of the suburbs. The overall prosperity of the late 1940s and 1950s produced a new spirit of consumerism. Government regulations, brought about through the efforts of the labor unions, resulted in increased wages and improved benefits, meaning Americans, for the most part, had more disposable income. Advertisers took advantage of the new medium of television to reach wide and eager audiences. The housing industry, largely dormant during World War II, built new neighborhoods around the edges of American cities, making the automobile a necessity rather than a luxury. The Big Three, GM, Ford, and Chrysler, increased capacity to meet the tremendous demand, setting new records for production in 1949 and 1950. By 1960, more than 3 out of every 4 American families owned at least one car. The infrastructure raced to keep pace with a nation on wheels. Superhighways were built, covering some 10,000 miles of road. Motels and fast food restaurants went up along roadsides, and shopping centers were built outside city centers. While imports would challenge the American automakers in the decades to come, it was the U.S. manufacturers that defined the post-war era.
Does yellow fever still exist?
Yellow fever, an acute infectious disease, does still exist in some select areas of the world. Outbreaks still occur in jungle areas. The disease was once widespread, afflicting people in tropical climates such as Central and South America, Africa, and Asia. But with exploration during the 1500s and 1600s, and the opening of trade routes during the 1700s, the disease spread to North America by 1699, when there were epidemics in Charleston, South Carolina, and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. 3 years later, an epidemic broke out in New York City. Yellow fever first materialized in Europe in 1723. An epidemic in Philadelphia in 1793 was determined to have been carried there aboard a ship from the West Indies. Nearly all of the city's people were afflicted by the fever, and more than 4,000 people died in what has been called the worst health disaster ever to befall an American city. Breakthroughs in controlling yellow fever came in the late 1800s and early 1900s. In 1881, Cuban physician Carlos Finlay, 1833 to 1915, wrote a paper suggesting that yellow fever was transmitted by mosquitoes. This was proved to be true by U.S. Army surgeon Walter Reed, 1851 to 1902. Who in 1900 headed a commission sent to Cuba to investigate the cause and mode of transmission of yellow fever. With this knowledge, U.S. Army officer and physician William Gorgas, 1854 to 1920, applied strict measures to destroy mosquitoes in Havana, eventually eliminating yellow fever from the Cuban port city. Serving as Chief Sanitary Officer of the Panama Canal Commission from 1904 to 1913, Gorgas implemented similar measures in the Panama Canal Zone, where the disease had been a menace. Again, his methods proved effective, greatly reducing the instances of yellow fever, which allowed the canal to be completed. In 1937 the 17D vaccine was developed by American physician and bacteriologist Max Theiler, 1899 to 1972. The vaccine was found to be effective in combating yellow fever. In 1951 Theiler was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for his discoveries concerning the infectious disease. Conquering yellow fever was one of the great achievements of modern medicine.
What was the Reformation?
It was a religious movement in Europe during the 16th and 17th centuries. It fomented inside the Catholic Church as people began questioning the Church's doctrines, practices, and authority. While the movement was preceded by a swelling dissatisfaction with the Church, the Reformation was officially, and some would say abruptly, begun in October 1517 when German monk and theology professor Martin Luther, 1483 to 1546, nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the castle church at Wittenberg, Saxony, Germany, launching an attack on the church. The movement continued through the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 48. And though the resolution to that conflict brought about a measure of religious stability in Europe, the force of the Reformation did not end there. Both the freedom of dissent and the Protestantism people know today are the byproducts of the movement.
What did the founding of Liberia have to do with the anti-slavery movement?
With the goal of transporting freed slaves back to their homeland. Members of the American Colonization Society, organized 1816 to 17. Made land purchases on the West African coast. The holdings were named Liberia, a Latin word meaning freedom. The first black Americans arrived there in 1822. But the Society's plan was controversial. Even some abolitionists and blacks opposed it, as they believed the only answer to the question of slavery was to eradicate it from the United States and extend the full rights of citizenship to the freed slaves in their new American home. Nevertheless, by 1860 11,000 freed black slaves from the United States had been settled there. Eventually a total of 15,000 made the transatlantic voyage to a secured freedom in Liberia. The country was established as an independent republic on July 26, 1847.
How is Picasso's work characterized?
It's impossible to characterize or classify the work of Spaniard Pablo Picasso, 1881–1973. Since his career as an artist spanned his entire life and he experimented with many disciplines. Picasso often claimed that he could draw before he could speak. And by all accounts he spent much of his childhood engaged in drawing. He was only 15 years old when he submitted his first works for exhibition. And by the turn of the century, when he was still a young man, he began exploring the blossoming modern art movement. The rest of his career breaks into several periods. His blue period, 1901–04, was named for the monochromatic use of the color for its subjects, and was likely the result of a despair brought on by the suicide of a friend. Next came his rose period, beginning 1905. When images of harlequins and jesters appear in his works, all to a somewhat melancholic effect. He soon began to incorporate aspects of primitive art, and later experimented with geometric line and form in his works, which were constructions or deconstruct ions, sometimes only identifiable by their title. In the spring of 1912 Cubism exploded, and Picasso was on its forefront. In 1923 he broke new ground with Surrealism. The key masterpiece in his body of works came in 1937 when he painted Guernica. His rendering of the horror of the German attack, supported by Spanish fascists, on the small Basque town of Guernica, in Spain. His career reached its height during the 1940s, during which he lived in Nazi-occupied Paris. Biographer Pierre Cabane summed up the last period, 1944–73, of Picasso's work. He invented a second classicism. Autobiographical classicism. His final 30 years were to be a dizzying, breakneck race toward creation. During this time, Picasso did not chart any new artistic territory, but simply created art at an amazing rate. After his death in 1973, his estate yielded an inventory of 35,000 remaining works, paintings, drawings, sculptures, ceramics, prints, and woodcuts. He left an enormous, even mind-boggling legacy to the art world. In a 1991 article in Vanity Fair, Picasso's friend and biographer John Richardson observed, "Almost every artist of any interest who's worked in the last 50 years is indebted to Picasso, whether he's reacting against him knowingly or is unwittingly influenced by him. Picasso sowed the seeds whose fruits we are continuing to reap."
When was money introduced?
The use of money dates back some 4,000 years, when people began using something of recognized value, such as precious metals including gold and silver, to purchase goods and services. In the absence of money, all transactions were made on the barter system, which is an exchange of goods and services negotiated by the parties involved. The introduction of money simplified the acquisition of products and services. The ancient country of Lydia, in the western part of Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, is credited with the first use of standardized coins, made of gold and silver, in the 7th century BC.
When did MTV first air?
Music television, MTV, made its debut August 1, 1981. When it was made available to 2.1 million cable-subscribing households in the United States. The format was all music, 24 hours a day. Audiences could tune in any time to watch popular rock artists performing hit songs. The notion of pairing music with video was not without precedent. The most obvious of which is the Beatles' 1964 critically acclaimed pseudo-documentary, A Hard Day's Night. What was new was the idea of airing music videos around the clock. MTV was the brainchild of John Lack, vice president of Warner Amex Satellite Entertainment, which owned the cable station Nickelodeon. He'd taken interest in the Nickelodeon program Pop Clips, a music and video show developed by Michael Nesmith, a former member of the pop group The Monkees. Lack thought the format had potential, and soon a young executive, Robert Pittman, just 27 years old, was given charge of the project. MTV was launched with 13 advertisers and a meager library of only 125 videos, all provided by the record labels. But MTV caught on, and by 1984 it had captured an audience of more than 24 million viewers, was showing a profit, and was soon spun off into a separate company by parent company Warner. The video colossus thrived during the 1980s, helping launch more than a few music careers. However, in the following decade VJs, video jockeys, had to make way for alternate programming on the music channel in order to keep audiences interested. In addition to the standard video programs, including theme shows such as Yo! MTV Raps, the cable channel broadened its offerings to include specials. MTV Spring Break and MTV Video Music Awards, as well as series such as Real World, Road Rules, and The Osbournes. All of the new programming was aimed at the Generation X audience, the very group of teens and 20-somethings who, in the 1990s, couldn't remember not watching MTV. Even though its audience was estimated to have declined by more than half since its peak, MTV remained a going and profitable concern into the 2000s. As advertisers continued to rely on the medium to reach the youth market.
Why did the Hindenburg use hydrogen to keep afloat?
The fact that Hindenburg used hydrogen might have been the airship's only flaw, and it was made necessary by the political climate of the time. Hindenburg was the fulfillment of German airship designer Hugo Eckener, 1868 to 1954. Whose Zeppelin company had enjoyed years of experience and success even as other airship companies folded. By 1934 Eckener felt that his successful Graf Zeppelin, which had made several transatlantic trips, was not well suited to such long-distance flights. Eckener envisioned a larger and speedier vessel. In the Hindenburg, which took her maiden flight on March 4, 1936, Eckener's vision was made real. Named for the German war hero and politician Paul von Hindenburg, 1847 to 1934. The immense airship measured 803 feet in length and had a diameter of 135 feet, allowing it to hold nearly twice as much gas as other airships. The vessel was equipped with the latest technology, including 4 Daimler-Benz diesel engines that allowed it to travel as fast as 85 miles per hour. Hindenburg was also a luxury liner. It featured private cabins, showers, dining room, promenade decks, picture windows, and even a pressurized and sealed smoking room. Cigarettes, pipes, and cigars had to be lit using an electric lighter. Matches were strictly forbidden on board. But there was one problem: Hindenburg had been designed to be lifted by helium. However, the gas was scarce at the time, and the United States refused to sell any to Germany, which had been taken over by national extremist Adolf Hitler, 1889 to 1945. The American government suspected the Germans might soon have military plans for their airships. Thus, the Hindenburg was forced to use hydrogen, 7 million cubic feet of the flammable gas.
How was the Colosseum ruined?
The Roman structure, begun during the reign of Vespasian, ruled AD 69 to 79, was disassembled during the Middle Ages, 500-1350. When its stones and blocks were removed and used to construct other buildings. The Colosseum, situated in the center of the city of Rome, was a giant, outdoor theater. Between 80 and 404, it was an entertainment center where battles were staged. Gladiators competed, and men fought wild animals. It could seat 50,000 spectators who were separated from the arena by a 15-foot wall.
When did people begin to write?
If writing is viewed as a means of communicating between humans, using conventional visible marks, then writing spans the entire history of visual communication from early pictographic picture writing, beginnings to alphabetical writing. The oldest picture writing identified thus far was found in Mesopotamia. Present-day Iraq, the valley between the lower Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This writing, called cuneiform, dates back to the last centuries of the 4th millennium BC. c. 3700 BC. The finding consisted of about a dozen pictures inscribed on both sides of a limestone tablet. The characters are made up of wedge-shaped strokes. The system was probably created by the Sumerians, a non-Semitic people whose origins are unknown. They probably immigrated to Southwest Asia, Mesopotamia, from the east. Cuneiform pictographs closely resemble Egyptian hieroglyphics. Picture script developed by ancient Egyptian priests and perfected by the first Egyptian dynasty. 3110 to 2884 BC. Egyptian hieroglyphics consisted of some 600 symbols, phonograms. Cuneiform and hieroglyphic systems were the predecessors to the alphabet.
Who was the first Englishman to circumnavigate the globe?
It was English Admiral Sir Francis Drake, 1540 or 1543 to 1596. Who set out in 1577 to explore the Strait of Magellan. He did so, investigating the coast of South America. He and his crew plundered coastal Chile and Peru in the process. Before continuing into the South Pacific and heading northward, he eventually reached the coast of present-day California, which he named New Albion. A name that did not stick, and claimed it for Queen Elizabeth I, 1533 to 1603. He continued sailing northward and is believed to have reached Vancouver still in search of the Northwest Passage. Not finding it, he was much too far south. Explorers would later learn. He sailed westward. He reached the so-called Spice Islands, today known as the Moluccas, in East Indonesia in 1579. Drake also found the Indonesian island of Java. Before continuing west through the Indian Ocean, rounding the southern tip of South Africa at the Cape of Good Hope and skirting the western coast of Africa northward to Sierra Leone. From there Drake returned home to Plymouth, England, where he landed in 1580, the first Englishman to travel around the world. He was knighted by the Queen 1 year later. It is also Drake who, along with his fellow countryman Sir Walter Raleigh, 1554 to 1618, bears the dubious honor of introducing tobacco to his homeland. In 1586 Drake returned from another expedition to North and South America, where he did battle with Spanish fleets for control of lands. He then picked up colonists in Virginia, who carried with them potatoes and the materials and implements for tobacco smoking. Drake remained in the service of the Queen for his whole life, going on to fight and defeat the Spanish Armada in 1588. On a mission to the West Indies in 1596, Drake died on board his own ship.
What were the French holdings in the New World?
The French possessions in North America, called New France, consisted of the colonies of Canada, Acadia, and Louisiana. The first land claims were made in 1534 by French explorer Jacques Cartier. 1491 to 1557, as he sailed the St. Lawrence River in eastern Canada. In 1604 Sieur de Mons, Pierre Duguay, c. 1568 c. 1630, established a settlement at Acadia. In present-day Nova Scotia, Canada, and French claims later extended the region to include what are today the province of New Brunswick and the eastern part of the state of Maine. After founding Quebec in 1608, explorer Samuel de Champlain, c. 1567 to 1635, penetrated the interior, present-day Ontario, as far as Georgian Bay on Lake Huron. Extending French land claims westward. In 1672 French-Canadian explorer Louis Joliet. 1645 to 1700, and French missionary Jacques Marquette, 1637 to 1675. Became the first Europeans to discover the upper part of the Mississippi River. 10 years later, French explorer Sieur de La Salle, 1643 to 1687, followed the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico, claiming the river valley for France and naming it Louisiana. While the French expanded their North American claims, the majority of French settlers lived in Canada. France lost Canada to Great Britain in the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 63. Louisiana changed hands numerous times before it was finally sold to the United States in 1803 as part of the Louisiana Purchase. It was France's last claim on the North American mainland. French culture and influence in these areas remains prevalent today. In 1635 the French also claimed the West Indies islands of Martinique and Guadeloupe, and its small surrounding islands, including Saint Barthélemy. In 1946 the French government changed the status of these islands from colonies to overseas departments.
What were the Salem witch trials?
A series of trials in Salem, Massachusetts, in 1692, the proceedings against 200 people accused of witchcraft became allegory for searching out or harassing anyone who holds unpopular views. Indeed, the 19 hangings that resulted from the witch hunt provide students of history with a cautionary tale about the hazards of mass hysteria. In the 17th century, people widely believed in witchcraft and that those who wielded its supernatural power could perform acts of ill will against their neighbors. Courts somewhat regularly heard cases involving the malice of witches. Before the notorious trials of 1692, the records of colonial Massachusetts and Connecticut show that 70 witch cases had been tried, and 18 of the accused were convicted. But nothing had reached the scale of the 1692 witch hunt. In January of that year, the daughter and niece of a Reverend Samuel Parris began exhibiting strange behavior. Upon examination by a doctor, the conclusion was that the young girls, ages 9 and 11, were bewitched. Compelled to name those who had bewitched them, the girls named a Carib Indian slave who worked in the minister's home. And 2 other women, one a derelict and the other an outcast. They were arrested. Hearings were held and others were accused, including upstanding members of the community whose only crime seemed to be their opposition to Reverend Paris. Members of his congregation became corroborative witnesses. By May, jails in Salem and Boston were filled with suspected witches awaiting trial. The court, now with a docket of some 70 cases, convened on June 28. Through the summer months and into September, 50 of the accused confessed to practicing witchcraft, 26 were convicted, and 19 were executed. The colonial governor of Massachusetts became alarmed by the number of convictions. He ordered the Salem court to disband and commenced hearings of the remaining cases in a superior court. Of 50 still accused, the court indicted only 23. Of these, there were only 3 convictions, all of which were overturned. In 1693 the colonial governor pardoned those whose cases were still pending and declared that witchcraft was no longer an actionable offense.
Why did Schoenberg face sharp criticism in his day?
The Vienna-born American composer Arnold Schoenberg, 1874–1951. Now considered one of the great masters of the 20th century, was derided for having thrown out the rules of composition for working outside the confines of traditional harmony. In his youth, he was a fan of Wagner's compositions, seeing each of his major operas repeatedly. A series of Schoenberg's early works reflect the Wagnerian influence. But just after the turn of the century, Schoenberg set out on his own path. The result was the 1909 composition 3 Pieces for Piano, which some music historians argue is the single most important composition of the 20th century. The work is atonal, which is to say it is organized without reference to key. Schoenberg abandoned the techniques of musical expression as they had been understood for hundreds of years. This was no small moment for the music world, and many reacted with vocal and vehement criticism. Of the outcry, Schoenberg remarked in 1947 that it was as if I had fallen into an ocean of boiling water. But he had his followers, too, among them his students. Though he was essentially self-taught as a composer, he became one of the most influential teachers of his time. It's interesting to note, however, that his teaching approach was grounded in the traditional practices of tonal harmony. He later brought order to the chaos of atonalism by developing a 12-tone serialism, showing how entire compositions could be organized around an ordained sequence of 12 notes. However, he never taught the method and rarely lectured or wrote about it.
What was the Abu Ghraib prison scandal?
News of the atrocities of Abu Ghraib, where Iraqi prisoners were being held by members of the U.S. military during Operation Iraqi Freedom. First surfaced in April 2004 when shocking photographs began appearing in the American media. The photos depicted an array of hideous abuses, all of them in violation of the Geneva Conventions for the Treatment of Prisoners of War. The deep troubles first surfaced in spring 2003 when International Red Cross and human rights groups complained that American troops had been mistreating Iraqi prisoners. The U.S. Army launched an investigation into its prison system. A fact-finding mission was eventually led by Major General Antonio Taguba, who completed his report in February 2004. It stated that one police company at Abu Ghraib had committed sadistic, blatant, and wanton criminal abuses. The Taguba report also found that supervisory omission was rampant at the prison. More investigations and reports followed, taking into account other prisons under Central Command. Some of the reports tied prisoner deaths to the abuses. The scandal sent shockwaves around the world and sparked an intense debate about how such abuses could have happened. The tortures were labeled by some as unauthorized actions taken by a few individuals, but others believed they were a manifestation of policy that had gone wrong. The scandal soon widened. By May 2004, British newspapers began reporting abuses by British troops. While Prime Minister Tony Blair, 1953, apologized for any mistreatment Iraqi prisoners may have suffered at the hands of British troops, President Bush went on Arabic television to denounce the abuses as abhorrent. He stopped short of an apology, saying that the mistreatment does not represent the America that I know. Both nations moved quickly to bring charges against several soldiers shown in the pictures. The guilty verdicts, and subsequent sentences, began being handed down in May 2004. The prison scandals fueled criticism of the controversial war in Iraq. They also prompted a deadly backlash from the Arab world. Insurgents in Iraq began a series of kidnappings of Americans and British citizens working in Iraq, most of them ending in ghastly and widely publicized killings. Between spring 2004 and spring 2005, more than 200 foreigners were taken captive in Iraq. More than 30 of them were killed by their kidnappers.
What were indentured servants?
During colonial times in America, there were two kinds of indentured servants, voluntary and involuntary. Voluntary servants were people, often trained in a craft or skill, who could not afford passage to the colonies. In exchange for their passage, they agreed to work for a period of 4 to 7 years for a colonial master. At the end of this period, the servant became a freeman and was usually granted land, tools, or money by the former master. Involuntary indentured servants were criminals whose sentence was a period of servitude. The impoverished, or those in debt, Most indentured servants were involuntary. Their period of obligation to a colonial master was longer than that of a voluntary servant. Usually 7 to 14 years. But, like their counterparts, the involuntary servants also received land, tools, or money at the end of their contract, and they, too, became freemen. The arrival of indentured servants in the American colonies addressed a labor shortage that emerged in the early 1600s. In 1618 the Virginia Company, a joint stock enterprise that encouraged the development of Virginia, adopted a new charter based on the head right system. Englishmen who could pay their own Atlantic crossing were granted 50 acres of land. Each of their sons and servants were also granted an additional 50 acres. Other colonies were also developed under the head right system, with the land amounts varying by colony. Soon there were more farms than there was labor to work the fields. The colonists solved this problem through the system of indentured servitude. Many indentured servants were drawn from England, Ireland, Scotland, and Germany. In European ports, people contracted themselves or became involuntarily contracted to ship captains, who transported them to the colonies, where their contracts were sold to the highest bidder. Roughly half the colonial immigrants were indentured servants. Colonial laws ensured servants would fulfill the term of their obligation. Any servant who ran away was severely punished. Laws also protected the servants, whose masters were obligated to provide them with housing, food, medical care, and even religious training. The system was prevalent in the mid-Atlantic colonies, but it was also used in the South. When the economies of the Caribbean islands failed at the end of the 1600s, plantation owners sold their slaves to the mainland, where they worked primarily on southern plantations, replacing indentured servants by about 1700. In other colonies, the system ended with the American Revolution, 1775 to 83.
What is Golgotha?
Golgotha is the Hebrew name for Calvary. The site on a hillside outside ancient Jerusalem where Jesus Christ, c. 6 BCE AD 30, was crucified, though the exact site is unknown. It is believed to be where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is located.
Who was Typhoid Mary?
Typhoid Mary was the name given to Mary Mallon, c. 1870 to 1938, the first known carrier of typhoid fever in the United States. Though Mallon had recovered from the disease, as a cook in New York City area restaurants she continued to spread typhoid fever germs to others, infecting more than 50 people between 1900 and 1915. The New York State Sanitation Department connected her to at least 6 typhoid fever outbreaks there. Officials finally and permanently institutionalized her in 1914 to prevent further spread of the acute infectious disease.
What have been the deadliest tropical storms in the world?
The deadliest tropical storms are not hurricanes but rather the unnamed supercyclones that sweep out of the Bay of Bengal. In the Indian Ocean, striking the densely populated Indian subcontinent. These storms have been known to kill 100,000 people or more. The fatalities numbered more than 300,000 when a 1970 cyclone struck East Pakistan, Bangladesh. That storm is still the deadliest cyclone to hit the region. But more recent Indian cyclones, which usually occur in April through June and September through November, have sometimes reached supercyclone status. An April 1991 storm packing 160-mile-per-hour winds and 20-foot waves swept over Bangladesh's low-lying coastal plain. There was no place for residents to seek shelter from the advancing sea. An estimated 140,000 people perished and 10 million were left homeless. Property damage climbed to more than $2 billion. In October 1999, another devastating cyclone struck the Bay of Bengal region. It was the strongest and deadliest since the 1991 disaster. 10,000 died and more than 1 million people lost their homes.
Is it true that Moses never entered the Promised Land?
Yes, according to the Bible, Moses, who was 80 years old when he led the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt, never entered the promised land of Canaan. After parting the Red Sea, which had swallowed up the Egyptian soldiers who pursued the Israelites as they fled, Moses led the people into the desert, embarking on what turned out to be a 40-year journey to Canaan. During this time, which is also described as 40 years of wandering, the Israelites lived under harsh conditions. This led them to distrust a God they could not see and to challenge Moses' authority. But Moses frequently appealed to God for help, and the Bible reports that he received it. In one instance, Numbers 20:22-12, God directed Moses to get water for the parched Israelites and their livestock by ordering a rock to yield its water. But instead of speaking to the rock, Moses struck it twice with his staff. Even though water gushed out of the rock, Moses had failed to follow God's instructions. Therefore, God later said to Moses, "Because you were not faithful to me, you shall not lead this community into the land I will give them." Eventually the Israelites reached Canaan, ancient Palestine. But God did not allow Moses to enter the promised land. He only viewed it from atop Mount Pisgah, in present-day Jordan, before he died.
When were the first Olympic Games?
The Olympics date to about 900 B. See, when, in ancient Greece, tens of thousands of sandal-wearing spectators descended on Olympia to cheer the runners, wrestlers, and bare-skinned boxers competing there. The Games at Olympia were one of 4 athletic festivals in Greece, the others being the Isthmian Games at Corinth, the Nemean Games, and the Pythian Games at Delphi, all of which alternated to form the Periodos, or circuits, which guaranteed sports fans the opportunity to attend an athletic festival every year. Winning was everything then. Athletes were required to register in order to compete, and rumors of Herculean opponents sometimes prompted competitors to withdraw. Victors were awarded crowns of olive leaves, and the second and third place finishers returned home undecorated. The modern Olympic Games, begun by diminutive Frenchman Baron Pierre de Coubertin, 1862 to 1937, possess a decidedly different spirit than did their ancient counterpart, where the only rules were that participants were not allowed to gouge, bite, put a knee to the groin, strangle, or throw sand at their opponent. The modern Olympic Games, publicly proposed by Coubertin on November 25, 1892, in Paris, and first held in Athens, Greece, in 1896, are based on their initiators' vision of the Olympic competition as an occasion to promote peace, harmony, and internationalism. In April 1896, some 40,000 spectators pressed into the Panathinaean Stadium, which had been constructed on the site of an ancient stadium in Athens, to witness the athletic feats of the first modern Olympic heroes. 13 nations participated, only male athletes, just more than 300 of them competed, and Greece received the most medals, 47. The second Olympic Games were held in 1900 in Paris.
What is a passion play?
A passion play is a dramatization of the scenes connected with the passion and crucifixion of Jesus Christ. The roots of the passion play can be traced to ancient times. Early Egyptians performed plays dedicated to the god Osiris, god of the underworld and judge of the dead. And the Greeks also acted out plays to honor their god Dionysus, the god of fertility, wine, and, later, drama. During the Middle Ages, 500-1350, liturgical, religious ceremonial, dramas were performed. Toward the end of the 10th century, the Western Church began to dramatize parts of the Latin Mass, especially for holidays such as Easter. These plays were performed in Latin by the clergy, inside the church building. Eventually the performances became more secular, with laymen acting out the parts on the steps of the church or even in marketplaces. The liturgical dramas developed into so-called miracle plays or mystery plays. As a symbol of gratitude or as a request for a favor, villagers would stage the life story of the Virgin Mary or of a patron saint. When the plague, also called the Black Death, ravaged Europe, the villagers at Oberammergau, Germany, in the Bavarian Alps, vowed to enact a passion play at regular intervals in the hope that by so doing they would be spared the Black Death. They first performed this folk drama in 1634 and have continued to stage it every 10 years. Attracting numerous tourists to the small town in southern Germany.
Who is Che Guevara?
Beto Che Guevara, 1928 to 1967. Was an idealist who became involved in revolutionary movements in at least 3 countries. The Argentinian, who had earned his degree in medicine in Buenos Aires in 1953. Believed that social change and the elimination of poverty could only come about through armed conflict. Guevara met Fidel Castro, 1926, in Mexico in 1954 and served his guerrilla forces as a physician and military commander during the Cuban Revolution, 1956–59. Once in power, Castro appointed Guevara as president of the National Bank of Cuba. Between 1965 and 1967 Guevara became active in leftist movements in Congo and in Latin America. He was leading a force against Bolivian government when he was killed in 1967.
How did Montessori schools get started?
The schools, evident throughout the United States, as well as Great Britain, Italy, the Netherlands, Spain, Switzerland, Sweden, Austria, France, Australia, New Zealand, Mexico, Argentina, Japan, China, Korea, Syria, India, and Pakistan, carry the name of their founder, Maria Montessori, 1870–1952. She was the first woman in Italy to earn a medical degree and to practice medicine. In 1900 Montessori pioneered teaching methods to develop sensory, motor, and intellectual skills in retarded kindergarten and primary school students. Under her direction, these unteachable pupils not only mastered basic skills, including reading and writing, but they passed the same examinations given to all primary school students in Italy. Montessori then spent time in the country's primary schools, where she observed the educators' practice of teaching by rote, by using repetition and memory, and their reliance on restraint, silence, and a system of reward and punishment in the classroom. She believed her system, called scientific pedagogy, which was based on non-coercive methods and self-correcting materials, such as blocks, graduated cylinders, scaled bells, and color spectrums, would yield better results in students. Montessori theorized that children possess a natural desire to learn and, if put in a prepared environment, their spontaneous activity would prove educational. Instead of lecturing to their students, Montessori encouraged educators to simply demonstrate the correct use of materials to students who would then teach themselves and each other. She also believed in community involvement in schools. Encouraging parents and other community members to take active roles in the education of the children. When Montessori put these principles into action, it was to highly favorable results. In 1909 Montessori published the Montessori Method, which was made available in English 3 years later and became an instant bestseller in the United States. Her method, which she believed would develop and set free a child's personality in a marvelous and surprising way, caught on. For Montessori, who has been called a triumph of self-discipline, persistence, and courage, spreading the message about her teaching method became her life's work. She was still traveling, speaking to enthusiastic crowds the world over. When she died in the Netherlands at the age of 81, Montessori's beliefs, which were both scientific and spiritual, had a profound effect not only on students in Montessori schools, but on primary education in general.